This is day 239 of Ukraine's resistance. We're Mediacentru Ukraine, and we are about to hold a discussion on change in Russian narratives, how to fight it, changes in the media market, how do we survive, and in general, we'll be talking about the media. Let me present first our guests today. I'll start left to right. With us is Olga Guzhva, project manager of the Ukraine Voices IWPR project. Sahaidak, expert at the Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security. Andrii Drozda, who we have indicated as a journalist. He is a practicing journalist, and it'll be very interesting to hear his opinion. With us is also Borys, professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University School of Journalism and Communication, and Otar Dovzhenko, head of the Independent Media Council. Perhaps the first question, let's start with the Russians. The Russians often change narratives that they apply to us, that they use to describe us and the situation. The most recent one is that they're trying to convince themselves and everyone around them is that it's the Ukrainians that are the terrorists, that we are the terrorist state. This started about a month ago, or rather after the attack on the Crimean bridge, and this is the frame that they're holding every day in every source. I am not asking about terrorism as such. I'm asking, how should Ukraine deal with this, both inside and outside, abroad, through the power of truth, through the power of propaganda, through the power of counter-propaganda? What tools are we supposed to use as a state, as Ukraine? Who goes first? It's up to you. You can raise your hands, or if you have something to say. Perhaps I'll start. So the changes in Russian narratives is not a new thing for us over the past 8 months at least. We're accustomed that the rhetoric constantly changes. It doesn't really have there's no really rhyme or reason to it, and we're also accustomed to responding to it and tracing what they're trying to convey to the internal audience, how they're trying to work with the Ukrainian audience, and how they're trying to work abroad. So we see all of these clear changes, from, they're not there and we have to keep bombing or bomb harder. We see quick changes from Kyiv will fall in 3 months to we're fighting NATO. In spite of this, Russia is trying to convince the world that Russia still wants to protect everyone, still wants to protect the Donbass from the Nazis, Crimea from water shortages, Africa from starvation, the West from the golden billion. They're trying to show this through force. They're trying to continue a policy of blackmail and terror, and this is also constantly present in the rhetoric of the Russian propaganda, in the entire and all of the audiences that I've mentioned. What is the policy of Ukraine? Well, it has been and remains after February 24th, 2022. Ukraine has gone from this more or less stable information stance, has gone on the offensive, and it continues this offensive. And apart from the fact that we're doing this reasonably well as a state, I would say, in cooperation with the civil society, with journalists, it's very important to communicate that in this information struggle against the Russian Federation, we do need an international coalition as well. Because the message that Russia is holding an information war, not only against Ukraine, but also against the entire world, is very important now, is very timely now. And in order to communicate it and to stress it to the West, because this it pertains to them, to their national security as well. So right now, this is we're on the offense, on the information offense, which requires support of an international coalition, much like militarily in the front. If I'm not mistaken, your structure is working with the Ministry for Information and Culture. Yes, we're part of the ministry, yes. and is responsible for what you call informational offensive. I wanted to ask, what sort of offensive? What is it supposed to mean? Let me draw an analogy. For instance, you have someone who acts badly, misbehaves. What do you do? Do you admonish them calmly? Do you ignore them? Do you use some kind of how do you what do you do with this? Not in general categories, but what do you do with this practically speaking? Well, first of all, I think the truth is our main weapon, abstract as it may sound. If we do not speak the truth about what is happening, and if we leave an informational vacuum, it will be filled by the aggressor with his narratives and his messages. Secondly, we need to show, as I've already mentioned, we need to show that Russian propaganda is still functioning in the European market, the Western market. Only yesterday, colleagues from Stop Fake translated an article that was published on Voice of America about how the French government is still allowing the broadcasting of many propagandist outlets in their satellite TV channels, and the activists have raised this subject to put a stop to it, to these broadcasts, because this will be propaganda that not only attempts to discredit Ukraine or our partner relationship, but is actually threatening to European society. So we need to show and involve the international community into the fact that that the Russian propaganda is working on their markets, not only the Ukrainian markets, and try to explain that it's not just the trolls and the bots and the social media, it's an entire network that is very damaging to European stability as well, in spite of the fact that it's continuing to spread a lot of disinformation and propaganda against Ukraine and what is happening in our country. Yeah, yes, sure. As far as the subject that Ukraine is a terrorist state, this is basically mirroring, right? Russian propaganda often uses this as a measure. Basically, when you see a clear problem of Russian imperialism with this kind of fascist umbrella, and this is exactly it's Russia that needs treatment right now, but at the same time they were trying to impose this matrix upon Ukraine in their propaganda, and there are many such examples. The story that Ukrainians are involved in terrorist acts by blowing up bridges and infrastructure. I mean, right, the Dugina case, right, is also can be seen as part of this line. This is basically mirroring. Even sometimes even preventively, they will accuse the opponent of doing what they are doing themselves. And in general, it seems that the West is starting to realize this, and often it is there, or it's at least been voiced, but it's not universally understood yet. We're still talking to some bubble of people with some, perhaps they're media experts or they're defense experts, or maybe they represent think tanks, and we hardly talk with those who have the alternative opinion. Right, the ultimate target audience, we don't talk to them. Who's going to be talking to the alt-right in the States, trying to, you know, someone who's alt-right and trying to get information from other sources which we treat skeptically or disdainfully, and we don't really know what to do with these channels. So we understand that we don't have the resources like Russia does to, build a propaganda machine. We don't have the resources, so the other solution is to work more with Western journalists, reporters, editing boards, and try to convey our point of view, our viewpoint, at least adjust this picture of the world. We see that, in spite of the fact that RT and other channels and other outlets, there were attempts to close this corridor of propaganda at some point, to maybe close down their offices, but in other hybrid forms, these propagandist Russian narratives appear even in mainstream media, such as, Euronews. Obviously, they have a whole Russian Russophone office, right, and the whole share. And even when we switch the channels, when we flip through the channels, if whenever you see Euronews, you often see this kind of uncovered, this kind of not even trying to hide these Russian narratives in a supposedly objective reporting, or we keep the distance, but the constant accents on the Russian position, Russian stance. It is often voiced, it is pushed into this sandwich, and it's there. Um, Even the New York Times or other key media may sometimes present materials, key materials, noticeable, key, important materials with pro-Russian accents. For instance, like why are Starlinks not working in deoccupied territories? And there was an attempt to basically say that, oh well, Elon Musk has refused to finance, and Starlink will stop. SpaceX and the Starlink project will stop supporting Ukraine, and Musk is distancing himself. And I mean, who was this aimed at? Was it the Western consumer? Maybe, but it's also echoes back to us, to our audience. Sending in who are then retelling each other or reading retellings of this in our sources, and often this news machine works in such a way that we don't reach any analysis. We just give the short summary of what's happening, and this is what brings the problem, right? The problem arises that we don't pay enough attention, enough time to interpret, to explain, to analyze what is written in Western media, and try to affect them, because that's a lot of work. And so really it is time, money, resource, including human resources, to change this picture of the world in the Western media. So the problem is there, but we also understand how Russia is working. They either mirror what they themselves can be blamed for, or they transmit complete trash that is difficult to believe for a rational thinking person. Like, why would the Russians be shelling Enerhodar, which they themselves have occupied? I mean, that doesn't make sense, right? But they're doing it. Or why would Russians blow up Dugina in Moscow? It's hard to explain this to a Westerner. Or Nord Stream. Why would they explode it? Were the Russians behind it? Who benefits? Do they benefit, right? And we talk on our with various Western experts, and the experts, it seems pretty clear to the experts. This is experts who have come from the defense sphere, from the security sphere, but I'm very unsure that a run-of-the-mill recipient of these stories or consumer of Western media understands this. Perhaps I'll ask Otar. The closing of Russian propaganda channels, is that an act of freedom of speech? Is that an act of state policy? What is it? Is it a act of our counter-propaganda? I often thank God that the people, both in the current authorities, the powers that be, and previously, that the people took these steps in spite of criticism, in spite of internal criticism, international criticism, all of these hysterics and scandals by Medvedchuk, etc. I'm happy that they had the balls to do this, that they had the courage to do this. Of course, if our information space was right now polluted with Russian propaganda, there would be more deaths. It would be a lot harder. There'd be a lot more problems. Of course, since the start of the full-scale invasion, we would have had to do something about this anyway, but thankfully it was done somewhat in advance, and the level of pollution in the information space has decreased a little bit. As far as the propaganda itself is concerned, and the Russian propaganda communications, I think by which I include myself in this and many in Ukraine, I think we're too preoccupied with looking for inconsistencies or gaps. Well, the Russian propaganda isn't trying to be consistent or lack gaps. The fact that Andrii says that it sounds like bollocks. Well, it has to sound like bollocks. When you say that the information space is a field of battle, well, reality is a field of battle, and Russian propaganda is trying to undermine this reality. And basically, if we read the basic concepts of what we now call hybrid warfare, the initial name was non-lineal war. Non-lineal meant that you undermine the traditional concepts of ours and theirs and one side and another side, and the actions can be completely disproportional, illogical, unclear. They can make no sense. They might seem to be harmful, but ultimately they have to lead to some kind of result. It seems to me that Russia is acting entirely within this postmodern concept of nonlinear war, and it's very important for us not to fall for it. Also, by the way, not to engage in this silly mirroring. You're Nazis. No, you're the Nazis. You're Hitler. No, you're Hitler. Ukraine has to. This is what Putin said himself, right? You are what I know you are. I know you are, but what am I, right? It's like what you call me, you are. Ukraine has to stop the shit slinging, so to speak. Ukraine has to take a disproportional step aside and form its frame, form its narratives that have nothing to do with the Russians. Because you will never have. You will never have there's not never going to be enough of you to catch every narrative. And another important aspect of Russian propaganda is that we shouldn't so often see it as a kind of communication act aimed at trying to convince someone of something. Really, mostly it's addressed at people who are already convinced. So it's a process. It's feeding this picture of the world that is often quite absurd, quite broken down, quite controversial, quite self-contradictory. They're dropping in various narratives into the information base that contradict each other. Yes, we will take Kyiv in 3 days. Yes, there's a massive, powerful army, so it will take a long time. We haven't even started yet, etc., 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 etc. If any of these narratives, in our opinion, don't seem to work, then it's simply not for us. It's for some other people whose picture of the world is nourished by them. And I'm absolutely convinced that the Russians are not zombified, that they're entirely sober, entirely pragmatic in their agreement with their propaganda. They accept the picture of the world that this propaganda presents because they benefit from it. And so when they see that, Ukrainians themselves are shelling their own cities and themselves are perpetrating genocide against their own population, and Zaporizhzhia is a eternally Russian land, they don't jump into saying, "Oh, you're lying to us." They agree, and actually, we're the same. When we see all this stuff about our authorities that they smoked the bridge is tired, therefore it fell. I mean, we don't exactly say, "Oh, stop lying," tell the truth. It was our army that broke this bridge. We wink and nod and say, "Oh yeah, sure." Well, right, something like that, yeah. So in any case, this is even understandable, right? People are living in this paradigm. They agree with this propaganda, and when another absurdity comes in, another insanity comes in from this propaganda, well, what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to lose their picture of the world? People can't do without a picture of the world. They subsume that into that picture of the world. How we fight that, how we counteract that is another question. I hope we get well, I wanted to ask how, because you do have the saying that, right, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Can you overcome propaganda while yourself being completely innocent of propaganda? Well, sure, it's an important question, but I wanted to respond to some of what the colleagues have said already. You were right? But I see the situation slightly differently, including in the sense that there's been a polarization of the audience, I think. By month 8 of the war, they've decided, they've picked a side, and I hope that the vast majority, we really hope that the vast majority are now impervious to Russian narratives, as far as, I think, by the way, this goes also for the West. For beyond our western borders, and some part in Russia. They've already determined the part that needed convincing to believe or not believe whether this is true or not true. It has really shrunk. It's becoming irrelevant. As colleagues said, there are people who want to hear Russian propaganda, including in Russia, and there's a huge number of people who in the West who no longer believe this. By month 8 of the war, whatever they say about terrorists, they know that it's all lies. And in this sense, if you elevate, maybe not a bird's eye view, but maybe a drone's, a UAV eyes view of this situation. And it seems to me that there are two elements of these narratives. It's this kind of it's this the speeches and the propaganda, the speeches, the writing, but the Nazis and the fascists, the Medvedev article, these kind of more poster-like propaganda. These aren't fragments, by the way. This has been going on since the Soviet Union, right? Lenin and the party are one, and they don't always work, right? Or they usually don't work, because already then they were seen as schizophrenic. Nobody really took them seriously. Same thing now, but there's also the propaganda narratives that I call kind of everyday social propaganda, right? If it's in the social media, that there's an energy, they'll be shutting off power soon. This is an everyday living situation. Or, by the way, or the story that they will come liberate Kherson and they will arrest you, or in Zaporizhia. Again, this is social anxieties. This propaganda addresses social anxiety, and we don't have enough lawyers who say no. The vast majority, 90, 98, 99%, the security service will not have any questions for you. This is not said enough. And so the narratives, these non-poster narratives, these smaller narratives, they're much more dangerous for Ukrainians now. So most people don't believe the posters, the big slogans, or the Nazis, the terrorists, but they might be susceptible to this social, everyday propaganda. Maybe, sorry, I'll just add that this kind of social, everyday messaging, scary stories, are also thrown into the European audience. So you will all freeze. No, we're just, the price of the Ukrainian war for Germany and France is too high. All of this is hitting your bottom line, the checks in the shops, etc., etc. All of this is in. Sorry, but to continue, I just wanted to say that Russians. We've had this very strange game, right? When it seemed that for Europeans and from the Westerners, the media information was something somewhat more of a sacred cow, right? Whereas Russians understood at some point that it's a weapon. And when they came together, it turned out that it's like a Cro-Magnon facing a Neanderthal, and a Neanderthal is not prepared to counteract, has nothing to put against that. So when I ask, is it possible to make an omelet without breaking eggs or without shutting down channels, I wanted to ask about, well, how are Europeans evolving? Can they overcome this while they remain with their attitude to information and freedom of speech as a sacred cow? So that's a good question, and actually this should be discussed. Well, just very briefly about the narratives. Yes, Russian narratives, they didn't just suddenly appear on February 24th. They have been developed for 8 years, and it's very good that we've held this informational assault, because against this disinformation, against these fake narratives that continue to flood our information space, we were always counteracting with facts through international teams that were working. We continue to do this now, and the question here is that we've won and we're holding the line among the expert, but the question is about the social, the everyday users of information, because it is they that have built this very effective channels of communication, and they're very effective there, and we're not keeping up. So we have the expert society, when the professional community, the journalists, our entire bubble understands, and we're speaking the same language. These things are all clear to them, but it's not clear to the everyday citizen, run-of-the-mill citizen, who's consuming fragmented information, and when they hear something, they take it, they accept it, and then they don't verify, because it's a question of ontological security. They want to build and somehow explain the huge number of things that they don't understand to themselves. War has changed the standards of providing information. International journalists have quickly reached this edge, this limit of horror, emotion in the materials that they were giving, and so it's very difficult now to surprise the West, right? They've already seen so many horrors, so many horrible personal stories, that it's I can't say that they're not interested. Of course, they're concerned, deeply concerned even, but they're interested in what happens next. So now we have to reform this, and we have to provide content of what's going on with those criminal cases, with those war crimes. How do we identify the criminals? How are the processes, the court, the trials? Because life goes on. This is important, and it's in this aspect that we have to maintain. We don't have to counteract the narratives. We don't have to say, "Oh, it's you, it's not us." We have to create quality content that will replace or push out all of this information from the information field. Well, in that case, can we talk about Western media? We're living in an age of journalism, not journalism of facts, but a journalism of emotions, right? Largely a story-based journalism, right? That is working in with big audience, large audiences. And so if you say that they're interested in the traditional seven S's, right? Death, sex, scandal, whatever, and we've given them everything. How do you maintain the level of interest? How do you? I mean, very cynically put, how many more miles of dead bodies do we need to build to maintain the interest from, I don't know, CNN or The Guardian or Reuters? I'll just say a few words, and then I hope the colleagues will continue. So it's not. This is not how you hold attention. You have to hold attention with the actions that are happening in response to all the horrors that are happening in the country. And really, all these things can last, can hold the attention, can hold somebody's attention. They might even be interesting for an audience, but we have to be clear that we don't understand, we don't know the ultimate consumer, we don't know the hierarchy of their interest for the content that we produce. So it's very important to have, I mean, now it's a question of self-organization within the professional community. What do we write about? How do we write? How do we form this shape this daily focus that we will broadcast onto? Because it's very important that this content about Ukraine is in the focus of somebody's attention. So it's not just photographs from the front line with the destroyed buildings, so that there's a continuation, so that the European reader, the English-speaking reader, and other readers are interested in following what happens next, in addition to the destruction, in addition to the crimes that Russia perpetrates. There is something else, and that has to be illuminated as well. I remember just when we were talking about war fatigue in March, right? Back in March, and we're all really afraid that, oh, maybe another week or two and the world will tire of Ukraine and the world will stop writing about us. And yes, it's true. We saw some peaks and troughs about what's going on in Ukraine, but we we were given a great opportunity. The world has learned of Ukraine, has heard of Ukraine. Perhaps for some people this was the first time, or for some maybe not the first time that we're as a country that not a backwater of Russia, and unfortunately found out about us in the context of war. But for us, this is a great opportunity that I think we are making use of. But we have to focus more on that and make more use of this opportunity. We have to inscribe Ukraine in the global context, in the world context. Tell more about us, even beyond this war, about what Otar said. Right. These positive narratives, we've been talking about them since 2014. That this information policy by Ukraine has to be based upon positive narratives, because yes, everyone tires of, in spite of the fact that the journalists want blood, but ordinary everyday people, I think they tire of blood. Well, the rankings of TV news seem to indicate that people don't tire of blood. Nevertheless, there is this demand, some kind of demand of the average consumer to find out more about this country. What else is going on there? What kind of people are living there? What do they do? And we have enough of these stories. This is one aspect. Another aspect is that we have to switch from the general to the personal. We have to tell more of our stories. We have to tell more about what's going on in our country. We have huge numbers of wonderful, talented people. Our territories are being liberated and businesses are coming back. We have to talk about how every person in this country is contributing to the victory. And bring up this individual. Well, what if they're not interested in this? What if they're interested in other things? Like I said, we have to give them these stories. We have to try through censorship. No, we have to sense. We have to try and figure out and interact. As my colleague said, we have to interact with journalists. They know better, and we have a lot to offer, but they know better how best to maybe not just stress on the role of the victim at war. Maybe talk to the practicing journalists, because our news that we had, also the most popular news prior to the war, that was made by Western professionals under the title, oh, it was some, killed, ate, and buried. I mean, obviously people are interested in the blood and bones, and so running into Western journalists, however much you tell them, yes, they're fully behind standards and principle, but the editors' offices want horrible facts, the rape and murder and the looting, because that's what people read. So how do we manage this? How do we figure out the Western press here in terms of both supporting interest and not becoming so heartless, not to become completely cynical? Look, the Western press will manage without us. They seem to be working quite a lot here for the past 8 months, and that there were whole outlets of CNN, of key publications. They know how to do stories, how to do analysis in their studios, analyze the map, the data, and they're doing reasonably interesting quality content. We in terms of shape and messaging, I don't think. I mean, of course, we might give them hints, but they're reasonably good at it already. The thing is that, yeah, there are a couple of these grand narratives that have worked for a long time. In our case too, the story of compassion for the defenseless victim who has been attacked by an aggressor. That's a pretty classic story, and it holds for a time. People feel compassion for some time. Eventually, people are consumed by their life, by other stimuli, and they switch to a different story. That I think in our context it works, and our propaganda uses it. This is the story of victory, of the underdog, of the outsider underdog over a much more powerful enemy. When they saw that we can actually give as good as we get. We got Kiev, and then the Izum operation, and again there's an attention. Everybody wants a piece of this victory. When you're winning, people are more fully behind, than someone who's constantly crying or weeping or dying, because it's best to throw out this little bird from the nest and not worry too much. And unfortunately, this has to be used in media story. The story of our success stories, our victories, how we keep sticking it to the Russians. Yes, the Russians in the picture of the world of key media outlets and most of these societies, the sociology seems to show both in the EU and in the US, they're the bad guys now. We just have to convey that we can actually beat them, and with your help, we'll do even better. And then you will be involved. You'll be able to say that you were part of this victory. You've benefited from this victory. This is a story that has to constantly be pushed. Then there's the world trends, right? Like the feminist trends, like women's stories. They work better than men's stories. From our experience in our producer center, with the media center, any story about women, particularly a woman that is fighting, this means that the media come in. Right, snipers, the bombers, sure, and I don't just mean the women who are victims of this war, but women who are involved, who are victors, who are living their lives, who are, or perhaps they are in the army. The stories of the children, they also find this resonance in the world, because it's kind of it's at the core of this kind of a more humanist vision of the world, and all of this needs to be calibrated in proper proportion, and has to be offered. We have to help our Western colleagues find these stories and convey them properly, which they're doing reasonably well, but we might help them. I don't think it will hurt. So as far as the media that we work with, it's still a machine. I mean, in general, all of our media, right? There's a big reformatting of the structure of the ownership and financing. The oligarch-owned media are going back into the past. In terms of 24, we're a huge YouTube channel, something like 24 million subscribers. We live off of YouTube, our monetized YouTube, and so this is where we're working. Like, well, what will YouTube like? What will YouTube not like? What will YouTube push? What will YouTube not push? This is definitely taken into account. So there are things that explode and things that don't, things that go viral and things that don't. Speakers, the guests, the formats, all of this affects it. And fortunately, YouTube, I mean, you can't do blood and bones and dead bodies. These videos don't monetize, so we don't have like a lot of flesh and blood and meat in the content of our channel. I don't know. Obviously, other channels also follow these rules as far as purely technical things. Maybe I'll just develop this in this question. Maria voiced an interesting opinion that we were thinking back in March that everyone will lose interest, and then they're not. I mean, no, it's growing. If we look at our media, the interest is growing. No, we're looking for we're talking about international media, and so perhaps we've also found ourselves hostages of some incorrect hypothesis that we've convinced ourselves that the interest in Ukraine will fall, but it's not really falling, or it's falling, but not as we expected. Of course, there are constant waves. You know, Russia does some new thing, and the wave. Well, we didn't like that they're looking at the bad guy. Well, Andrii's right in saying that it's not just the sex and the blood, right? There's a huge spectrum of stories which are really well done, and many of our journalists would do well to take a page out of their book. But if we look at Politico, The Hill, or Wall Street Journal, there's very serious analysis going on. And now there's a bit of a machine going on. There's an expectation. They have to analyze the fighting, what the consequences might be. Now it's a long-term intellectual interest for intellectual materials, experts, etc. So these channels are already in place and they're already functioning. Both CNN and Politico, they have a pool of people that they talk to, that they interview. Maybe it keeps, it's in flux, but these channels are there, and it's a matter of having to support them. Like, I have a few friends in the States or in Poland who, once a month, especially if Russia does something, or if not, then just once a month, they write to me and say, I'm watching you, I'm following you, but just give me the lowdown from your opinion. They want an update to see what's going on from your point of view, and we do that. Even universities, not just media, they're pushing a lot of information, and even if there are no sensational, which is a good thing, it's a good thing for us that there are no sensational news to report, because there's fewer deaths, but it's important to keep these channels open, both in terms of at the level of media and at the level of social networks, because people are prepared to listen. Thank you. Just to add, I fully agree that we have to produce, in addition to the image of the victim, which is useful, we have to also present the image of the victor and provide this kind of content. And this is something that we could do, and there could be different options. There has to be the stance that in spite of, right? And then you have women, and you have businesses that come back, and all kinds of different stories. Because, why do we have this story? Why do we have this idea that people are less interested? Well, because in March, in April, there were a lot of journalist teams. They were all over the place. They went to the front line, the contact line. They wrote a lot about this information. Then they left. Physically, their numbers decreased, and we say, well, the demand has shrunk. But they write more profound things. They're more interested in, okay, so we've published materials on the horrors and the rape that happened personally with someone. But then what? 10 media have written about this. Someone's given interviews. But then what happens? How does life go on? Have the perpetrators been punished? Have they come to justice? And this really does have to be remain in focus. And again, I wanted to point out that the point of view of the victim, the stance of the victim, is also used by Russians when they say they're victims of propaganda. These things have to be conveyed too. These things have to be transmitted too, because they're conscious. They're consciously taking on the rules of the game, and they are responsible for that. They share the stance of their government. In that sense, they are no victims, and these things have to be voiced. No, this is. I'm sorry. This is all very right, but just one thing that I thought, the startups that might draw attention recently. These are things we all know, right? The wordometer that constantly shows live how much money is spent on war, on narcotics, on drugs. If there was something similar to Ukraine, I don't know if we should add it to Worldometer or a separate startup, but for the world to see, how much has been destroyed and how much will Russia be in reparations? Okay. If both you and Andrii are pushing a little bit farther in that direction. No. Wait. Sorry. Just a drop of healthy cynicism, a grain of healthy cynicism. Look, it's really awesome that there's all these ideas about how to draw attention by Western media and hold their attention. But let's be real here. What is our goal? Let's ask ourselves, what is our goal? Is our goal for Ukraine to be in the focus of attention? That shouldn't be our goal as such. If that is the goal, then it's a very complicated goal. The biggest story in the past 80 years is the coronavirus, is the COVID. It had to do with everyone. Millions of people died. Entire economies collapsed. People stayed indoors for months. That's a much bigger story for the world than like the Ukrainian war. So what? Did it stay in? Keep attention for more than a year? No, a year down the road, the media wrote. It's like what Olga said. Yeah, they said yes. There's a lot of publications on this subject, but is there the same attention, the same sort of suspense, the same sort of demand for this content? No, but we create the connection between the attention and the help, right? So I believe that if our goal is for us to get support, for the support not to diminish for Western societies, and not only Western. Again, we have to look at the global South that we have so far largely ignored with our attention. If they had at least some kind of general idea that their governments should support Ukraine, then it's not necessary that the media shows what's going on in Ukraine every day. We have to give them clear feedback on to the material and moral investment that they have already made into Ukraine. And really, I will draw an analogy here. You will see all kinds of volunteers, collecting. We're collecting 200,000 hryvnia for a car that will drive D-bombers around. We do this. Everybody brings in their 500 hryvnia. They buy the car. Here's the car. Here's the vehicle. Here are the happy soldiers. Here's the car driving off. Ideally, the car saved somebody's life. Do we provide this kind of feedback to the societies that are supportive of us? Frankly, we focus very little on giving them feedback on how important their support is help to us how important their help is to us. And I've often said this in interviews by the military administration. Well, the Western journalists, they constantly want to film Western weapons and how it works, but you understand we can't show them this. Well, show them the damn thing. A Frenchman comes in looking at how their Caesars are killing Russians. Let them see it. Film them yourselves and give it to them. Doesn't matter, but give them, let them tell their people. Look, our Caesars are bringing the victory of civilization closer. I think that this should be like a first prime objective, to show the world that supporting Ukraine makes them better in their own eyes, that investment into Ukraine pays off, that because constantly saying that we're this endless hole that needs humanitarian aid, but it's never enough. I'm very scary that I'm very frightened that we might end up like Syria, a place in the world where for 10 years there's some kind of horrible grinder. Everybody's forgotten who's fighting whom. Everybody remembers that there's a war, but nobody particularly sympathizes. God forbid. We have to retain some level of subjectivity here. Yes. And again, we forget that if we don't say something, the Russian propaganda will say it. They will use they will use some jack in Arizona to say, look, you have to pay more for your right. They're saying this stuff like that, right? They're no longer. So this makes a lot of sense, and I support my colleague's point that look, like I said in the beginning, you have to show the involvement of people to what's going on. So there's not some kind of abstract Ukraine or not some abstract struggle with some abstract Russian disinformation, but specific cause and effect, and that way we will be able to maintain it. And then maybe this takes us to a subject that Andrii was pushing us to, and Borys, I'm not pushing anyone to anything, about monetizing YouTube and startups. It's a very simple subject, really. It's the market. The economy has collapsed. There's no advertising market. There's no support for the media. The media are either dependent, but we're going through a de-oligarchization at the moment, or less dependent, but we don't have commercially viable media, which of course threatens a lot of media right now, and raises the threat, raises the question, raises the specter of thousands of people will be forced to change their profession. How do we save the media? How do we save the profession? Well, I don't think we're under threat of the destruction of the media in Ukraine. It's just that this market was overblown. Honestly, over the past few years, we had people who were interested. These owners of the media, we now call them oligarchs, who held their media. There was different level of involvement in editorial policy, but it was always there. Sure, in some segments, but YouTube, but in printed media, they don't have. No, they don't. But we were never a reading country. We were never a reading country for printed media. Even next to like Poland, if you look at Gazeta Wyborcza and if you look at our key newspapers of that, like we had The Day, that's dead. The Mirror Weekly, where is that? Right. So like you have Express, even like Express, which is a tabloid. When a tabloid is dying, that is clearly an indication that this segment of the newspapers and the journals that is going away. There are some niche things, right? Like the local history, Forbes, and there's some quality publications that exist at lower levels, and people who are interested will buy it and might even pay a little more for that newspaper or that journal. But we don't have dailies. We didn't have the culture of daily. I remember my grandfather read Village News, Sisky Visky. That was his paper. That was something he understood. That was a paper that spoke his language. But middle class or even higher, who didn't have the habit of opening the newspaper every morning, right? Like in the ideal picture of this kind of imagined Britain, and it still inertially kind of exists. All of these publications like the Telegraph, the Guardian, etc. That we didn't have the culture of printed media, and it's dying. Should we make this a tragedy? Well, right now we have a digital audience, and of course the structure of the media is changing. These are multimedia platforms that attract social networks, and of course it affects their delivery. How the Telegram affects, because the Telegram is another audience point. How the YouTube affects it. It's a different language that you have to use to talk to people for gaining the views, because that's the KPI, and if you have the objectives, the editorial objectives, this is all taken into account. What goes viral, what doesn't, what takes off, what doesn't. It's the different rules of the game. We have Instagram media like Svidomi, right? That's an Instagram media that uses visual means and tells short stories. But these are young people. This is actually UKU, Ukrainian Catholic University environments. It's an independent media that is supported by USAID and other grant support, but they're an independent media, and they see it in this format. They worked with the young youth audience. So really, the perception of the information itself is changed from a textual to a visual with the new generation, and this all affects there's a lot of factors at play here. We're really in flux in a very dynamic world of information reality that has changed a lot in our that has really changed in the past 5-7 years. So television won't be there. It'll be all YouTube and TikTok. Well, I don't know if it'll be constant, but it will definitely be present. YouTube and TikTok will definitely be there. There are local platforms that have taken off, and you can't manage without them. I wanted to add a little bit. I think we have to see what's happening not only as a challenge but also as an opportunity that arises. Of course, we can't say we can't speak of the trends and consequences of transformation because the transformations are ongoing and they will be ongoing for some time. But already we can state that we don't need so many low quality media. Why do we need so many low quality media? And so we have a situation right now that it's in this very uncomfortable way is reformatting the market. Secondly, there are the processes of where the subjectivity of the media community the self-organization processes within the media community are happening, and this is very important because the events that are taking place have catalyzed the media because you can't self-organize otherwise. Secondly, there's the opportunity for local media now to learn more about their audience, reformat their editing boards, refocus the problems that they cover. Really, the local media that are now in contact line territory, they're more interested in frontline materials, and then it will be a challenge then. Well, how do they refocus, eventually after all this is over? And how do they reformat their work? But what do these media need now? The media that have remained on the market, that have survived, and they continue to work, they need financial support that will ensure salaries for the journalists that are working there, and this is the most important thing. Then we can talk about the structure, the management, the whatever educational measures. Right now, the editing board have to preserve themselves and survive in these conditions. This is the most important thing, and it's a matter of urgency, right? We see a problem, we solve it, and then we proceed and look at transformations and consequences, problems, and what happens next. So the media has left its comfort zone, would you say? Well, we've all left our comfort zone. I wanted to frame this in the context, and slightly wider context, friends, because I think starting from '09, I was looking at a text called "The End of Journalism," and it was very widespread in the world. By the way, it didn't make much of a buzz here. Right, we had the COVID pandemic. There was a massive crisis of the media under COVID. Went into an even harder crisis during the war. But if we look at the Western world, since the start of the century, they've been looking at this subject. They swiftly switched into how to save from the end of journalism to how to save journalism, and there were a lot of methods. Right, we've already known that they're introducing, like taxes on the tech giants are being taxed. They're paying something to Australia, something to Europe. Some courts have awarded some damages or punishments or fines. It's now being seriously contended that when advertisers have direct access to us through social media as consumers, that the media are not necessary, that now serious media must be financed like libraries or like public services like libraries or like the post office. So the media are no less important than like the post office and libraries to a democratic world. And so they have to be financed, but maybe such that the state doesn't have the final say. There are models. I mean, you have like BBC has. Like we're not opening independent channels now during the war, right? So this is an old subject, but it's particularly pertinent to us now, and no one is talking about, apart from from foreign grants, no one's talking about like the monetizing YouTube. Andrii will not tell us how much YouTube and some advertising, what percentage it covers of the expenditures of the channel and how much they need in terms of support. And he won't tell us, or will he? I would say that we can fully survive as 20. We were fully covered by YouTube because it's a big channel. I will say this. I won't give you the exact number, so I don't get fired after this. But these are hundreds of thousands of dollars. Our YouTube channel is making hundreds of thousands a month. How much of this goes to salaries and how much of this remains as as incomes, pure income, that's a question for the for our leadership. For you know what? I'm thinking back to the book by I'm thinking back to The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and as I was reading this, I kept having this terrifying feeling. How can you not value human life, but only think about the survival of genes? Well, you will die, but your genes will subsist, will survive. Same thing here. Like, your publication will die, but journalism of your country will be better. If some people can live with this idea, can comfortably live with this idea and say goodbye to their job and go work in some other fields, then probably it's easy for them to talk. In reality, a lot of the media will close down. A lot of the people who work in the media will lose their jobs. The reason is that the media market was overblown, it was too big, it couldn't keep up financially. But the Darwinist approach that will, thank God, it will be the best and the fittest and the strongest that will survive, it's pretty, but it doesn't really correspond to reality, because unfortunately the good are closing too. Well, yes, we're opening channels. The channels are joining into TV marathons. Who, I don't know who's paying for it. I mean, realistically, we've had a lot of losses that I am very sorry for. Media that will be lost without a trace. Journalists who will leave the country and will never ever come back. Editing board that will fall apart. Of course, after this we will become stronger. Of course, Ukrainian journalism has had a fantastic experience that no one else in the world has right now, and it's right now playing a good game in the conditions in which it finds itself. But at the same time, I don't know, I see this as more tragedy than a purification process. I'm sure that Ukrainian journalism after this will survive, but I think that the scale of problems we'll have to deal with will yet make us miss 2021. Including, by the way, the impact of the state and the attempt by the state to impose either financial or editing control over a lot of the media, including through the Foundation for Media Support that they're trying to form now. And this is actually, like, think about it, like the donors will be donating money to a state foundation for supporting the media, and then the state foundation for the support of media will be distributing grants to commercial media, right? Well, we've spent 20 years fighting this, right? So, I mean, it's great that the media are learning to use grants. It's dangerous that the media are getting accustomed to grants. It's great that the advertising market is coming up again. It's dangerous that it's coming up in its worst expressions. Yeah, it's great that a lot of journalists are now have the experience in working for international media, like as fixers or reporters. Let's hope that they don't want to leave Ukraine and stay there, although maybe they may be of use there. On this optimistic note, if no one has anything else to add, perhaps we'll wrap up here. I would like to thank very much the participants of the discussion. I will present them now from the other end. With us were Otar Dovzhenko, head of the Independent Media Council, Borys Potyatynyk, professor of the UKU School for Journalism and Communication. With us was Andrii Drozda, a journalist. With us was Sahaidak, expert of the Center for Strategic Communication Information Security, and Guzhva, program manager for Ukraine Voice IWPR. Thank you all very much for the discussion. We will continue our work tomorrow.